Hi, I'm Zeynep Coşkun Koç, a research fellow at Sharq Forum. Today we are in Istanbul for our conference towards a new security architecture for the Mena region. I have with me Mr. Tarik Yousef. He's a senior fellow at Brookings Institute. Welcome, Mr. Yousef. How are you?
How are you?
Thanks for coming to our event.
My pleasure.
How has it been so far?
So far, it's been a busy, long day, too many issues to cover, and not enough time to discuss them all.
Summarizes the region, I guess.
It does.
So today I want to talk with you about the youth in the Mena region. I want to refer to your paper, actually, which predicted the Arab Spring and missed by the boom, hurt by the bust. And in your paper, which was I think in 2009, you talked about the youth disenfranchisement in the Mena region and how they missed the economic opportunities that came with the boom, and they've been hurt by all the lack of education and lack of opportunities, and how you were talking about that this was going to lead into some kind of a civil strife and some kind of political problems and civil disobedience, and eventually a year later the whole Arab Spring started. Looking at your work now and looking at the situation of the Arab world and the youth, in the post-Arab Spring world, where do you see the youth engagement and what's happening right now in youth in the Mena region?
Well, I think the broader agenda of youth economic empowerment pre-Arab Spring is still relevant today. That agenda focused on economic opportunities, jobs, finance, entrepreneurship, housing, education, all the things that we believed at the time would create the paths for young people to become economically independent, prosperous, and ultimately happy. And we recognized at the time that the economic dynamism of youth would help support social peace and political stability. And that in fact, the opposite, which was marginalization, exclusion, disenfranchisement, will create precisely the underlying conditions that would eventually lead to the Arab Spring. So it was my opinion at the time, and still my view today, that amongst the underlying causes for protests, protest movements, protest activities are grievances, some of which are economic, exclusion from public life, from economic prosperity. 5 years after the Arab Spring, I think many of those underlying conditions have further deteriorated. On top of which, economic conditions more broadly and political conditions more broadly in the Arab world have deteriorated. And so in 2017 today, one can safely say that in fact, the generation that was hurt by missing the boom and shouldering the burden, the consequences of the bust pre-Arab Spring, has continued to pay the price. And that even the generation after them, their prospects are not even better, are no better. This reading has consequences, obviously, for whatever outlook we come up with for the next few years. That outlook at this moment is being shaped by how countries in the region and even countries abroad are viewing youth. The discourse has evolved away from thinking about economic empowerment, economic opportunities, to emphasizing the consequences of the lack of them, which is radicalization, terrorism, with priorities for countries being the prevention of radicalization and terrorism and countering that. This strikes me as being a very self-defeating response. It goes after the symptoms of the problem, but it doesn't deal with the underlying issues. It provides a security response to what is fundamentally a socio-economic condition, namely a very sizable segment of the youth population in this region being excluded from public life, underachieving economically, being marginalized socially, and feeling increasingly that the only response, the only path to improving on their condition is possibly through radicalization, violence, terrorism, especially when you have recruiters and social media that helps promote and recruit. So this moment feel the agenda that we started off with 10 years ago, or that we left off with, is not only relevant, but the challenges to addressing the problems are bigger now. Because the priorities for a lot of the countries and for the world at large are not even on the economic empowerment, which probably is not sufficient anymore. It is now about security responses, the fight against terrorism, anti-Daesh, anti-Qaeda, emphasizing the national security priorities of states versus the socio-economic priorities.
So you're in a way saying that the current emphasis on security, both internationally and regionally, is actually exacerbating the underlying causes, and that we are yet to see another series of revolutions or more violence and civil wars.
So if we continue down the path where we emphasize security solutions and de-emphasize economic solutions, we will ultimately and inevitably confront the failure of these solutions and aggravate already very weak political stability, and in a lot of cases, political failure and state failure across many parts of the Arab world. You cannot have a security response to a complex socio-economic problem that affects a very sizable segment of the population. And if you don't have the economic resources and the outside world is not helping you and the global economy is weak and economic growth has slowed down and investment is largely absent from being an engine of economic prosperity and growth, the socio-economic problems you have today will only get worse. The political grievances they will create will be bigger, and the manifestations of these in violence, and terrorism, and radicalism will only be more intense.
And from all this you're saying, that I'm understanding that this towards the new security architecture for the MENA region starts from the socio-economic reforms. Let me pose this question though, like after the coup in Egypt, and Sisi came, and there was a lot of, and now the IMF has a new aid package. Can we say that the socioeconomic reforms or aid is not absent, but directed at wrong places?
Or alternatively, what we can say is the economic aid package is probably too little for what Egypt needs to do. You know, economic reform packages for Egypt and a number of countries in the Arab world were we thought were a thing of the past. They were a 1980s, 1990s project to help country deal with some important macroeconomic imbalances and to address structural problems. We dealt with the macroeconomic imbalances at the time, but we never really tackled the structural reform programs. We were never serious about them. And that is why a decade later, our youth continued to underachieve and to be excluded and to be marginalized. So I view the IMF package as maybe an important ingredient into stabilizing an economy, but it's not an answer to a country's need to have a national development project that will enfranchise its people, especially young people.
Sincere national development project, exactly. Not a cover for
absolutely.
corruption.
In the same way that Greece's economic program was only designed to stabilize the country, but not to restructure Greece as a society and a polyethylene economy. The magnitude of the problems today in Egypt and many other countries are such that throwing money at them will not solve them. You need a serious national effort, political, economic, social, with society participating in it. Elite, members of ordinary society, youth especially, working together to achieve some national vision. I don't know what the national vision of this region is, or even for most countries in this region are, other than the priorities that emphasize security, internal stability, and maybe avoiding economic catastrophe. Some very important, but they strike me as being insufficient objectives to move a country from where it is today to where it should be 5 years from now. And certainly relative to the issue we started discussing, which is a broad agenda eating at your core foundations in society. Youth exclusion, youth marginalization, youth disenfranchisement, which has now become youth radicalization, youth violence, youth terrorism.
My final question is that indispensable and very urgently needed grand vision, grand agenda, where do you think it could emerge from? If it could emerge.
I would say this was the question we struggled the most with today. We recognized in most of our discussions that the regional order that we grew up with and lived with and were a part of has collapsed, is collapsing, and that we will see the rebirth or the birth of a new regional set of security arrangements. How much of these arrangements will be shaped by countries, or in the cases many cases we discussed, the actors in the region, versus international actors and the international order at large, remains to be seen, especially at a moment when we all recognized that the international system itself is evolving and that we're probably witnessing a realignment where the role of the US will change possibly, the role of international regional actors, Russia and others, has increased, and where we have regional players who are actually exercising power, influencing events. How all of this will add up to new regional arrangements is probably the biggest and most important question facing the Arab world in the next few years.
Thank you, Mr. Yousef, for all the great, insightful conversation.
Thank you.